need support staff to clear the room. Stand up and walk. Now.
Hello and welcome to The Watch. My name is Chris Ryan. I am an editor at TheRinger.com, and joining me on the other line, he's got Sylvie Steinitz on speed dial. It's Andy Greenwald.
Hi. Happy Thanksgiving, buddy.
What's up, man? Great to see you today. A stacked show. We've got the reaction to the finale of The Undoing from you and I. We've got Mallory Rubin joining us to talk about the latest episode of The Mandalorian. And then we have our interview with Melissa Maerz, our old buddy, talking about her book about Dazed and Confused. It's really exciting. We'll get right into it after this.
This episode is brought to you by Anytime Fitness. We may talk a whole lot about sports, but when it comes to keeping fit ourselves, there's definitely room for improvement. I hit this point early July. I was just like, I am not in good enough shape. I started trying to walk at least 15,000 steps a day, or hiking, or just anything to keep my legs moving. Now it's the end of 2023. I feel great. I had a physical 3 weeks ago, and the guy was like, "You're doing great. You're doing better than you were 3 years ago." I felt great. Whatever your goals are, progress is possible thanks to Anytime Fitness. Get a personalized plan and support from an expert coach anytime, anywhere. Visit anytimefitness.com to try Anytime Fitness for free. Start to train for your life. Terms, conditions, and restrictions apply. See website for details.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. From your morning podcast to your afternoon playlist, State Farm knows you personalize your entire day. And that's why State Farm helps you personalize your insurance with the State Farm Personal Price Plan. It offers coverage options that help protect what you care about most at an affordable price just for you. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices vary by state. Options selected by customer. Availability and eligibility may vary.
What's up, brother? How are you?
Is this the show?
Yeah, of course it is. It's always the show.
Are we recording?
It's all one show, man.
I just listened to the beginning of our friend, not really our friend, Mark Maron talking to Mike Campbell from the Heartbreakers.
Yeah.
And those dudes just talk fucking gear for like 7 minutes about like the magic of Fenders versus Rickenbackers and the what you got to do to get in the headspace for a Les Paul. And then like 7 minutes in, Mike Campbell sips some coffee and he's like, "So are we going to do this?"
Yeah.
That's us. We're just talking about our lives. Chris, I hope you had a decent holiday. I hope all our listeners had a decent holiday. Hopefully you didn't travel or venture too far from their personal pods. I'm a little self-conscious because I'm a little heady, as we were discussing. I'm a little congested. That's something that still happens, apparently.
How many different board certified doctors had to tell you that today to get you in the right headspace?
I wonder if we have any listeners like this. Like, is there any more annoying role to play than being the doctor in someone's family? Do you know what I mean? Because my cousin is a pediatrician.
Right.
And I texted her because we usually spend Thanksgiving with her and her family. And obviously we didn't this year. But I was communicating with her on Thanksgiving. And I realized by scrolling through our texts that basically our texts are, what time is Thanksgiving? What time should we be over? That was fun. Here's a picture of all of our kids together. And then 11 months of photos of bug bites or rashes on my children's body being like, this okay?
Yeah.
How's this look to you?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
No, I don't have any doctors in my immediate family. So I usually just solicit opinions where I can, you know?
What you used to do, which I always admired, was you would just crush episodes of House.
Yes.
And then just
deductive reasoning. I was sort of like an amateur physician myself.
I think you certainly felt that way. Chris, obviously, this is a really stacked show, as I said to you on text yesterday, and you responded with, "Yep." So I feel like we're on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely. Should we just get into The Undoing?
No.
Okay.
That was the beginning of a caveat because I wanted to bring up something else with you.
Okay.
Before we got into it, which was, obviously a lot of political news still in the country, and you know us, we don't like to put our thumb on the scales. We report, you guys decide.
I want to let Brian Kemp do his job.
That is a civic leader that we can all admire in these difficult times. But I did notice that a very accomplished and deserving person named Jennifer Psaki was named as President-elect Biden's incoming press secretary. And she's familiar to people who listen to Pod Save America or are paying any attention to the Obama White House, et cetera, et cetera. But it did remind me that I feel like the statute of limitations on this has worn off. Chris, do you remember we had a phone call with Jen Psaki?
Oh, yeah. Was this when they were like, do you want Obama to come on? Yeah.
I feel like we should talk about this because it's so crazy. It sent me on a deep dive into my email, and I found the emails from Jen Psaki at her whitehouse.gov account, and I can't believe this was real. Like, I truly,
well, it
this
turns
is
out
so
it wasn't because he didn't come on the podcast.
So for people wondering what we're talking about, which is probably 90% of our audience at most times during our podcast, flashback to those golden years of early spring 2016.
Yeah.
A young Kenyan socialist was still in the White House, and your boys were still just podding away on opposite coasts at the time. And we had the opportunity to do the HBO after show for Game of Thrones. By the way, Casey Bloys, that's some content you can still just plug onto Max anytime. It's available.
Just slide it right next to the flight attendant.
No problem. It'll be great. And so we were feeling pretty good. We were excited. This is a lot of opportunities. And that was also at the time when our friend Dan Pfeiffer had left the White House, but I think was one of the people responsible for spearheading a kind of alternative media strategy.
He went to go work at Dominion, correct?
Well, first he did a study abroad, which was weird because he was 39 in Venezuela. But he's passionate about the culture. He's passionate about it. He thinks the cops on The Undoing was perfect casting. And he was sort of doing the strategy. I mean, that was around the time when Obama went on like Between Two Ferns and went on Marin, and they were getting the word out and putting him in front of different audiences, right?
Getting the word out about the leader of the free world.
About being American president. So somehow it reaches us that Obama is a huge Game of Thrones fan. Huge. His bit, and everybody's got a bit at the dinner table. His bit was, House of Cards, that's not what DC is like. Game of Thrones, that's what DC is like, right? That was his bit, apparently. And he's a big fan. And so someone was like, he would want to come on your Game of Thrones after show just to chop it up. Mm-hmm. Much like subsequent guests, Haley Joel Osment and T-Pain, basically same diff. And this escalated to the
same
point
level
where
of Secret Service detail for sure. Yeah.
Haley Joel runs deep. We had a planning call with the White House that I had to take pacing on my cell phone on Skirmerhorn Street in Brooklyn because I had to pick up my kid from daycare. And we were like, whatever the president would like to do, we're amenable. We could come to DC. We could do whatever. And we thought this was a possibility. They were very polite to the point where I found an email, and maybe I should share some of this on Instagram, where I was like, hey, Jen, great talking. As you can tell, Chris and I are really excited about the possibility, are you ready for this? Of POTUS's involvement in the show. Who are we? And I laid out like 6 bullet point strategy. Like, does he just want to come and talk about the episode? Does he have a point of view? Does he want to talk politics? Does he want to just like deep dive on Littlefinger? Mm-hmm. Like, basically, your guy here wrote an email being like, whatever Barack's comfortable doing, we can really be amenable to him.
As you never wrote back, right?
Could you? You're a master of voices and sound effects. You're kind of the Frank Welker of your era. Could you?
Is that the guy from Police Academy? I can't believe how long we're going to be talking about this.
I'm done. I just want to say, could you do the crickets that we got in response?
Oh, I mean, it was like the chorus of all of the world's remaining forests.
Yes,
screaming into the void with cricket noises. That's how hard we got dropped. And we should not have even been offered this podcast opportunity in the first place. But yes, it is one of the most treasured full-on rejections of my life.
What I want to say is nothing recommends Jen Psaki for this job more than this experience.
Yeah.
At least as
she
far
knows
as
how to
we're
weed them
concerned.
out. Yeah, for sure.
She saw the chaff coming a mile away and she just tossed it. So congratulations, Jen Psaki. Thank you for taking our call. Thank you, listeners, for taking this time down presidential memory lane with us. I'm sure Joe Biden has reached out about a Ted Lasso pod, but unfortunately, I'm not interested. So let's talk Undoing.
Let's do it. So this show became a little bit of a phenomenon, at least on the timeline. I don't know what the actual numbers are, but it was definitely like I got the feeling like a lot of people watched it yesterday at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific or whatever, and it got to the end, and then it just was a really like fun 30 minutes on Twitter when, especially I want to shout out Ben Dietrich, the author of the Brian Colangelo story for The Ringer, who had has a very funny like running bit about Hugh Grant's innocence on this show and how they framed him.
I'd like to read that. I'd like to shout out Taffy Ackner, the brilliant profile writer and author, who just, I believe at 10 p.m. Eastern, just tweeted Christ. I knew what she was talking about.
So I think that we had a lot of fun for a lot of reasons with this show. One was some of the ridiculous behavior. Obviously, we got to talk to Hugh Grant. That was awesome. We were very amused by the international house of thespians that they had on the show and their varying levels of commitment to accent work. But one of the reasons why I was into it was just a little bit of the theorizing that went into, well, this is one of the rare mysteries that I feel like has not been cracked by the audience before the finale. You know, that there is not, that there is still a lot of stuff up in the air, that we're not really sure who killed Elena, and could it be Jonathan? That seems too easy. Could it be Grace? They haven't really explained how that would work. It really seems like it would have been Henry. That was the Watch Clubhouse favorite. I obviously was all in on that little guy. And the red herring of all the red herrings was that there were any red herrings at all. The person who was originally charged with the crime committed the crime. He was a bad guy, and he gets hunted down by two easily accessible helicopters who spot his Range Rover among the millions of cars breaking north out of New York City on what seems like a glorious spring day in the Catskills. And, you know, he gets caught.
A couple things. I believe it was the great Raymond Chandler who coined the phrase herring. It's just a regular herring of no particular color or hue, except in this case, Hugh Grant. Right. Two, Chris, you haven't lived in New York for 8 years, but there are readily accessible helicopters available to
No, I know.
all the
Apparently
elites.
you can get Uber Blades, right?
Uber Blades. You can pick one up at the what was that? The Century. What was that like clothing store that had like discount bargains? It was like
Century 21, right?
Anyway,
H&M?
There's a helipad right down by Zara on Prince Street. You can just take it wherever you like. You don't even have to return it. I'm not sure where to begin here because
I have a couple of things I want to hit on. I want to hit on the legal system and where we're at with that. I want to hit on Sylvie Steinitz and the erasure of her from the story. I seriously do want to talk about Elena and the sort of grand treatment of that character in the totality of the show. Where do you want to start?
I guess what I want to start just on a very macro level is I want to just contextualize my own reactions to the show, because one thing that I've definitely picked up on from talking to people, and people have really wanted to talk about this show, you know, and I've joked about it in the past, that we're lucky to have many listeners. And there's also a subsector of like a half a dozen women in my life, some in my family, some just friends or colleagues, who feel they have the fast track toll booth thing for our relationship and the podcast, where they don't have to listen to us. They can just text me and ask for the opinion I gave on the podcast.
Right.
And all of them have checked in to talk about this show. And I think that there is a major fork in the road here, because I think that the majority of people who watch this show, and I don't mean to sound this,
and your binders full of women.
Well, just friends of mine and people in my family, but then also looking at Twitter, and I think that you're going to agree with me on this. People really had fun with the show, and it delivered the kind of, classy whodunit that they wanted to have during a difficult time in America on Sunday nights.
Yes.
And if that's what people wanted out of the show, I think people were generally satisfied, and we can obviously quibble about the specifics of the end. Your boy here, I think, definitely in the minority, but I remained pretty frustrated that the show never wanted to be anything more than that. And I was particularly frustrated at the end, because I think that the no twist that it was Jonathan all along is pretty interesting and compelling. Mm-hmm. And I think beyond that, once Grace decided to become a Harvard-educated psychologist again after sitting a couple of episodes out, that idea...
that degree got a little dusty
that
for a few episodes.
But suddenly, front and center, doctor, that seemed baked into a show, this idea that an incredibly successful let's just call it what it is, an incredibly successful Karen, could be so blinkered about her own life that something like this could happen. And so inoculated from trouble, both by her standing and her degrees, but also very much her financial privilege, that this would undo everything.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, the show either didn't have interest in pursuing that or didn't have the time. It wanted to be kind of a salacious courtroom thriller, and fine. But that was my personal calibration of disappointment with the show, because I thought that other stuff was kind of interesting, and I may have been in the minority.
I thought it was super fun. I thought the show was really like a great distraction over the last couple of weeks. I really enjoyed. I looked forward to each Sunday. I watched it linear. I watched it week to week. I never really skipped ahead except for when we had to for Hugh. And I enjoyed the hell out of it. The last episode is not good. Because the last episode is not good for a very specific reason. It's not fun. And it's not actually the show that it was before that. I enjoyed the fact that it was not any kind of satire or analysis of upper class New York society. But I do think that it betrayed whatever like light character work it had done going into that final episode by just making everything bend around a twist. Now, that happens all the time. Like, twists are probably they have a little too much gravity in our contemporary storytelling. Like, you know, the sort of solving this mystery and what would twist be. But I was kind of taken out of the entire experience when Nicole Kidman's testimony happens. It would have been actually interesting if they had kept Jonathan's public defender. If they had kept the sort of raggedy guy who's eating steak and fries with Grace and is sort of just trying to like make a name for himself, but does not have the muscle to kind of try a case like this. They make a huge deal about them paying for Haley Fitzgerald. And I actually really enjoyed that character throughout the season. I thought she was like a welcome, like hard edge, cynical, funny voice, even though she claims she's not funny throughout the season. But she gets dunked on in such an embarrassing and public way, both in that last testimony, but the entire like hide the hammer bit, which whether that's ever happened in the history of jurisprudence or not, like maybe not, but I don't know. You have to tell me, because I know you're closer to lawyers than I am. Like, I think that she would get disbarred immediately for that, right? Like, that is...
You make it sound like I'm Big Meech or something. Like Haitian Jack over here. Yeah, I got some lawyers.
I know you got lawyers who will eat the case. There's just so many like, guys, this wouldn't happen. And I actually thought, like, most of what the prosecutor does in Grace's testimony when she does her cross-examination, isn't it inadmissible? Isn't she basically saying, like, I heard that you had a talk with this person on Skype? Wouldn't they just be like, what Skype call? Like,
well, yes, that's what they said. But then the judge suddenly woke up from his torpor
and was like, you called her, like, this is your witness, so anything goes, right? You
brought this down on yourself. Yeah, I mean, you're asking me to, you're sending me back to my 1L days, which didn't exist. So I know nothing about whether that was accurate or not. I think generally the opinion of lawyers, and I am married to one, like, once you enter the courtroom on a TV show, they're just like, that's cute. That's fine.
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, let's let it be what it would be. Yeah, I felt like, first of all, replacing one lawyer with the other was interesting because it changed up the speed, right? But I don't think it was, my initial suspicion was that maybe it was like an O1 visa thing, but in fact, both those actors are British. So sure. HBO was just paying for all that paperwork regardless, so it didn't really matter. I do wonder if the finale of The Undoing will have an effect on some of the Trump campaign's court cases going forward, because I do think it seems possible that they might be more successful if they mirror Haley Fitzgerald and just stand up and sit down in the sassiest manner possible. I really appreciate that actress being like, how many more pages left? Okay, I'm going to take 3 of them to sit down because I'm not liking this. I really appreciated that. Okay, so there's the lawyer thing too, but this speaks to my point again, which was the fortune that is just available to them. And you'd think that Nicole Kidman saying, Daddy, can you buy me justice, essentially, for however many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars he's all in for at this point, between bailing out Jonathan and then paying for this months of the best defense that money can buy. And then he's like, I'm so proud of you for shanking your own husband in this court case.
Yes, I love you so much.
And then by the way, the helicopter's gassed and ready. Like, there is no consequence to any of this. And again, like, there starts to, occasionally when the show seemed to want a little edge to bleed in, like when they call Miguel to the stand, right? And they once again cast aspersions on the kind of hot-blooded, angry Latino family. And he storms in on them. How dare you do this? You're ghouls. And then the takeaway is, yeah, they're ghouls. But mostly we're just still impressed with Nicole Kidman's poise and her hair, and we move on. So I just found it sort of frictionless. It was sort of hard to find a way in on that. I guess we did find the answer to the question, why is Lily Rabe hanging around here? Which was so that she could sort of surreptitiously tank the case with her old classmate. By
doing the Ferris Bueller, like, I saw this person at Baskin Robbins last night.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess, I would just say about the Elena character is that I found the sort of like the fatal attraction twist at the end sort of to be, not twist, but it was sort of this idea that she sort of attacked Jonathan to be unnecessary. I don't know. I guess like that part like rubbed me the wrong way. I saw some folks on Twitter talking about how like Elena never really gets any kind of agency in this show. She never gets seen by anybody but these like the white eyes of the characters, you know, and is talked about in that way. And even the way that she's shot with her husband is like in a different way than like all of the other scenes in the show. Like
they use the Chino filter that they used to use on Ryan in the OC.
Yeah.
Whenever they would go to his rough and tumble neighborhood.
Yeah. So I thought that was a little ridiculous.
It's right. I mean, the show, that's the thing. And let's just say it again. No one was tuning into the show for its nuanced view on classism in New York City. Like, that's just not what this show was. And it probably was more successful all across the board because it was laser focused on being this kind of high class, salacious soap opera. That's what it wanted to be. And it more or less succeeded along those lines. But you're 1,000,000% right that the show kept, in order to make the red herring-y show that Kelly wanted to make. And it's worth noting, you and I have not read the novel this is based on, but one of the things I learned, I think I picked this up from Mark Harris's interview with Hugh Grant that ran this morning. I think on Vulture, people should check that out, is that the book makes it clear from the beginning that Jonathan did it. And it's really more about this character, the scales falling from her eyes or whatever, and slowly realizing this. But to make it a TV show, Kelly wanted to muddy the waters and do this kind of, maybe it's him, maybe it's her thing. And as part of that, they really amped up this, well, Elena was crazy. She's passionate and crazy. And her husband is angry and hot-blooded, but they weren't characters. I mean, they didn't matter. They only mattered in as much as they kind of briefly, temporarily messed up Nicole Kidman's life before she could helicopter off to a brighter future.
I love the idea also that like Nicole Kidman has gone along with this entire thing the whole time. And then Grace gets put on the stand and is just like, well, I'm under oath. So, it's just like, so she's like, if the prosecutor had been like, did Jose Altuve steal signs? She would just be like, yes, he did.
Yes, I have to admit it now. And my years of Astro fandom were for naught. One thing I do want to note, though, I hope people listened to our talk with Hugh Grant last week. It was great fun. I thought he was great in this episode.
He obviously had a blast in this, yeah.
Great throughout. I mean, for as much as the show tried to muddy the waters and chop things up and show flashbacks and sideways and, oh, is it Grace, whatever, he was pretty focused on the part he wanted to play. And this comes across from the Mark Harris interview, too, that he knew from jump that this guy was a narcissistic sociopath and just played the hell out of it. And I think his performance throughout is phenomenal. I hope he's recognized with awards for it. I do want to say, he kind of spoiled it for us. Because when we spoke to him last week,
we were saying that we were like, it's Henry,
Well, but not just that we were like, can you tell us, I know all actors hate doing this, but could you pretend to be a publicist and like give us something racy or like give us a sizzle for the finale? And he was basically like, oh, well, I do things I've never done before, whatever. And it's just like, well, he's pretty much done everything except club a woman to death with a hammer.
I was holding out hope that what he was referring to was when they get to the bridge, he squirrel jumps off of it and lands on a wave rider being driven by Kenny Towers.
Yes.
Just goes off to Canada via riverboat travel.
I mean, he did seem to know that people could track him by cell phone early in the series because he left his phone in the apartment. So clearly he didn't have real plans to escape because he's driving a car that is presumably like low jacked or whatever with 2 cell phones beeping away inside of it. And, you know, for people who don't know the region, it's not like you cross the George Washington Bridge and you're at Lake Erie. You know what I mean? Like that is a 6-7 hour drive.
Yes.
Until you sniff Niagara Falls.
That's a long time of just singing road songs with Hank, you know?
Last question for you, Chris. You know, I think longtime listeners know that you were a pretty exceptional lifeguard back in the day.
Uh-huh.
That bridge didn't seem that high. Is that gonna take him out?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, here's my thing: is what I really want is Undoing 2. Jonathan Fraser runs the yard. I want Prison John, and you know that Hugh Grant would do it. You know he wants to be challenged. Just get him start up. Get him. He's the shot caller now.
Oh, I love it. He's big dog. Nobody messes with him. So that would be the redoing. Yeah. And then you could do a Nicole Kidman spinoff called The Updoing, which is about when she gets a ponytail and tries to make that work. Look, it's funny. I guess I just want to point out, like, I am falling victim to something that I think that we've been talking about, which is like, we are at this moment when TV, particularly prestige TV, like that's a pretty overused term. And HBO, it's found a nice little pocket here for these very, you know, sort of saucy soap operas, basically, HBO version of them. And I keep getting distracted and being like, well, this is supposed to be better than this. And I don't know if it needed to be better than this. It executed, right? So I think that it's probably going to be considered a success, even though neither of us like the finale.
It's a stripped down version of it because the Big Little Lies version of this story is like a B plot about Lily Rabe and a C plot about Donald Sutherland and a D plot about the cops or about somebody else. You know, it's got a certain sustainability to it, and it would probably feel a little bit less like light in the foot. The way Undoing, to me, I never dreaded watching it. I always felt like it was going to be propulsive and pretty, you know, edge of your seat viewing, even if it was like empty headed at times. But it definitely, this is an example of like the sort of the downside of that kind of storytelling, because that's all you got at the end. And if you screw it up at all, then nobody really cares about what happens to Grace. She's not an identifiable character in any human being kind of way.
I mean, and you're not helping yourself when your last image of your relatable heroine is, you know, safely ensconced back on her private helicopter.
No.
And that was the end. Like, was there anyone when it ended? Do you think
also
anyone
just
was like
just takes Henry from a crime scene? It's just like, we're out.
Like, we're out.
They don't need a statement or anything.
We are extra legal. I mean, that's the thing. Sorry to keep harping on this, but like, that's more interesting to me that these guys that the Donald Sutherland is a nation state unto himself, right? Like, he clearly has all access pass to the Met. As people have been obsessing over Twitter, like, he has an apartment that overlooks 3 major landmarks in Manhattan that unless you're in Doctor Who's TARDIS, don't abut each other. Like, his version of reality, their version of reality is kind of interesting, but instead it's a cocoon the show retreats back to. So
we'll leave it at that. We're going to get into our conversation with Mal about the Mandalorian. Then we have Melissa coming to talk about All Right, her oral history of Dazed and Confused. I just want to say a little bit of housekeeping. If you have not checked out, please do check out A Teacher, because we've got Hannah Fidel coming on Thursday to talk about that. We are also going to be going heavy on Industry on Thursday, and then we have some special guests coming on the following Monday to talk about Industry.
Also, I'm very excited to fire up Small Axe, and we'll talk about those movies. These are the director Steve McQueen's series of 5. He's calling them films. Some are shorter, some are longer, all about the Black, British, and immigrant experience throughout the last few decades, and hearing rave reviews about them, and looking forward to checking those out.
All right, let's get into our conversation with Mal. All right, Andy and I are so happy to be joined by Mallory Rubin, our old running buddy from the Thrones after shows, and our pal in real life to talk about The Mandalorian. Mal, what's up?
Just an honor and a privilege and an actual delight to be here with you today. Thank you both for having me.
I wanted Mal to come on. We wanted to talk to her about The Jedi, the most recent episode of The Mandalorian, which featured Rosario Dawson playing a beloved Star Wars canon character. And when I asked her, she said she was a little rusty with her canon. Yeah. And I was like,
didn't want to let you down.
Well, I mean, with Andy and I
do have 6 pages of notes prepared though, for what that's worth.
I knew it. I knew you.
How much time do we have?
Well, before we get to your notes, I want to just do a little bit of big picture stuff and also just sort of general impressions, because I think that this show.
By big picture stuff, do you mean a movie draft for like 2008? Because Mallory and I are uninterested.
Little cynical there.
Uninterested.
Count me in. Honestly.
I want to talk a little bit because I was thinking about how this show has now entered the throne zone, where you can watch the show and you can just enjoy the hell out of what you've just seen, the 30 to 45 minute episode you just watched and the story you're watching on screen. And you can take it and you can go about your life and go to the other room you're allowed to go to in your house. Or you can watch the show and then spend hours afterwards reading about it and reading about the characters and reading about what this might lead to, characters we might see down the line. And this is when I remember when we were kind of like a season or two into Game of Thrones and it started to become this huge pop culture phenomenon outside of just something that was like kind of like for the very specific fans of the story. People started reading Jason's column. People started listening to you guys on Binge Mode so much. People really were interested in having this sort of extracurricular study of the story. And it feels like that's where we've kind of arrived with The Mandalorian, although still with the format of this adventure of the week, episodic, almost like 50s TV Western style storytelling. For you, Mal, I mean, it must be a pleasure to have another thing that's like that.
Well, as you know, Chris, I don't have much else going on. So it's a great gift, really, to be able to immerse myself fully in a world that I love and be surrounded by characters that I love. It's funny that you ask that and open with that, because I think that was the thing I was most interested to hear from you guys about, actually. Like, Ben Lindbergh wrote about this in his column for The Ringer, recapping this episode, which is outstanding. I would encourage everyone to read it and to read Ben every week. This idea of the two lenses through which you can watch the show, and whether it is as satisfying for the viewers who maybe don't have that history with the characters, for people who didn't stand up and shout when Ahsoka mentioned Thrawn's name in this episode, for example, or who don't have history with Ahsoka, who aren't speculating about whether Ezra Bridger might be poised to enter the story, all three of which are things we should return to and discuss in more detail later in this episode. But to me, that's like one of the great master strokes of what's happening right now, is that it can kind of be anything you want it to be. And, each individual person can only have their own experience, obviously, and their own, history and their own desire to explore the world to whatever extent they choose. But I thought that this episode in particular, which was my favorite episode of The Mandalorian and genuinely and truly one of my favorite episodes of TV ever, full stop, I thought it was incredible, is that if you're coming to it and you're interested in Beskar and what is going on with Din under that helmet,
Beskar, man.
And you've just been waiting. I know you do. You're like, when am I going to get a Beskar spear? When? You've just been waiting to learn Baby Yoda's name, to understand more about his history with the Force. All of that meaning the story that is unfolding anew in front of us, the story that is specific to this show and this creation. What an episode. And if you haven't quite had that ember of hope that Star Wars can properly unify canon snuffed out, which I had not, this was like a transcendent experience. Because I think that, and I'll stop talking soon, I promise.
Nope.
I got excited once I started. I'm sorry. One of the pitfalls, and we don't need to turn this into Rise of Skywalker dunk fest or anything, but I think pretty objectively
Greenwald perked up.
I have 6 pages of notes about that.
I'm sure one of the pitfalls of Star Wars period in recent years has come when any given iteration has attempted to connect back maybe too fully to the origin, to the original trilogy, to the roots. I think that when Star Wars does that well, though, it's still one of the most satisfying things in storytelling. And I think that this episode was canon unification at a level that I wasn't quite sure was possible anymore. The threads that have been brought into this story, the Clone Wars animated television series, which I adore, the Rebels television series, which I adore, both of which are Dave Filoni's babies, basically, and he was the director and writer of this episode. You're talking about novelizations, original novels, the prequels, Anakin's story, which is, of course, the Skywalker saga. There's some Snoke Palpatine we could get into here, which I'm less excited about. All of it works. All of it works. And this just feels like it's setting up not only to position The Mandalorian for these really rich installments that simultaneously give us that adventure of the week episodic experience that's just kind of like poppy and fun, but also unfurl this richer connected text, not only for this show, but for the wider universe and galaxy. And that's one of the things that's the most exciting about Star Wars, thinking about how big the galaxy can be.
This, kind of like with Thrones, I think that Mallory and I are good examples of the different types of fans that a show can engender. And I am 100% the casual fan of this show. In fact, more casual than Mallory's straw casual fan that she suggested that even uses the Mandalorian's name, which I had forgotten. And frankly, had no interest in remembering. And yet I still feel very connected to the adventures of the show and enjoy it. And I think that what's really amazing, and we talked a little bit about this last week when we were praising the previous episode, which was not nearly as good as this one, is how just profoundly easy they make this look when in fact it's incredibly complicated what they're doing.
Yes.
They are tightrope walking something that I thought, not just in the realm of Star Wars, I thought was kind of impossible with contemporary giant IP shared universe storytelling. And that's the problem of every plank of the, now I'm losing my metaphor, but every plank of the Beskar armor, you want to do that?
Every pauldron
has to both be on its own, has to be a story in and of itself, and also advance the cause of the larger narrative and please everyone. And that's how you end up with, manic nothing burgers like The Rise of Skywalker that try to do everything to everyone all at the same time and end up doing nothing. And what this is doing is giving us characters we care about and setups that we understand that are very palatable and entertaining and enjoyable, while simultaneously sketching on the back of the giant Star Destroyer of canon to the exact right degree. This show would be a very different beast, and I think it would kind of be a disappointment if it was we are going to tell explicitly, this is what happened after Return of the Jedi, setting up whatever the hell happened in the subsequent trilogy. This is the show that will finally spackle in that hole. That actually seems to be part of its project, but that's not its explicitly stated project. It's not just going to be about the Darksaber and Ahsoka and all of this. It's about these two people as they kind of hopscotch around and dance between the raindrops. And I wonder if this might be overly simplistic, but I kind of wonder if it just comes down to the right hiring decisions. And they seem to have given the show over to what seems to be a healthy working partnership between Jon Favreau, who is a big tent, big picture kind of mass market filmmaker who clearly likes Star Wars, Chris, in the way that you and I did. We liked action figures and we liked seeing the movies when we were kids. And Dave Filoni, whose work I was ignorant of, but has spent the bulk of his lauded professional career worrying in the little crevices of this larger story. And they seem to have a very balanced working relationship that allows a show like this to be both all the time. And it's very pleasurable for it.
Yeah, I think one of the coolest things that's happened between season 1 of Mandalorian and season 2 of Mandalorian is the importance of Mandalorian in the world of Star Wars. Because when this show first came on, it was kind of like, this is on streaming. We're going to do this episodically. We can take our time, maybe connecting it to canon, but what it is like, it's not a curio, but it was definitely like a little bit on the margins. And I don't think it's an overstatement to say that with Friday's episode, it took center stage in the entire franchise. It's hard for me to even imagine them doing a post-Rey Star Wars story at this point, because they've clearly found a place where the chronology of this galaxy makes a ton of sense right now. And they can kind of play within these years in between these movies. They can overlap with the movies. They can tell different sides of different stories. So there's all of that. And I feel like there was something about this episode that felt very momentous. The running time was longer than most Mandalorian episodes. Right. It felt more significant. There were obviously these big reveals. I'll say another thing. Mal, you were asking about like, Ben's point about who watches this or why do you watch this? Mm-hmm. If this show, to pick a random TV show, a TV show, honestly random, a TV show that I adore, if this show looked like Justified, if it just looked like a TV show, I don't think it would hit with me as hard. I don't really know. We did
literally get Raylan Givens this season, right?
I know. And you'll never hear me say a bad word about any of Justified at all. I'm just saying that if it looked a little bit more like a traditional television show, I don't think that I would be as engaged with it. Now, that being said, I'm not necessarily like, well, this is just obviously an homage to Throne of Blood. It's like, I think that there are some very obvious hat tips going on here. But it's the way that they've internalized those hat tips. It's the way that they're like, the cool way to show Ahsoka showing up is just to see the lightsaber in this foggy, fucked up forest, and iconic. To shoot it from the perspective of the people on top of this battlement in this fort who are just like, doom is coming, and that's actually tricks that George Lucas was using. That's how Vader gets introduced when they're in the hallway and they're just shaking. You don't see Vader. You see people's reaction to what they think is coming. That's just good storytelling.
Right. You associate that first moment with the sound of the breathing and the reaction of the people that he's about to...
In many ways, Chris, The Mandalorian is an homage to fighting in hallways because even when they're in a town, it's somehow more fighting in hallways. And I'm not complaining. Yeah. That's important to the franchise.
I think, Chris, that point you just made feels really fundamental to what set this episode apart from, even as you're saying, prior installations of this actual show. Like, take another Filoni episode, actually, from season 1, episode 5, The Gunslinger, the Tatooine episode, right? Mm-hmm. Now, of course, we have since been back to Tatooine, and it's really fun. And I think if you revisit that episode, actually, there's a lot there to enjoy. But that episode, which again, I still liked. I mean, I've had fun every week of The Mandalorian, elicited a little bit more of a almost like Force Awakens response from the fan base of, do I need to kind of keep having this same experience or like Easter eggs and an homage for the sake of saying, hey, this thing, like you will recognize this creature or this dune, right? Right. And the distinction ultimately between facsimiles and attempts to replicate or approximate something, and between love letters that actually tap into why people care about the thing in the first place. And I think that's what this episode nailed. And I think that gets back to the point that you guys were making before too, about the Favreau-Filoni partnership. Like, that's what I associate most with Favreau right now. And I think probably just because we're doing Binge Mode Marvel, and I've been thinking a lot about like, do we talk enough about what an amazing thing it was to make Iron Man and launch the MCU that way? And the heart of that, of course you could talk about all the focus groups where even the people who were doing it were surprised about the kids basically saying, I want to play with this toy, and how much of everything that followed came from that. But that ultimately the seed of it that flowered into this amazing thing that has like defined cinema for a decade was, what if we had like the people who really love the stories make them? Mm-hmm. And I just think that like that's been the thing that has stood out to me the most about getting more familiar over the last few years with Dave Filoni's work. Like this idea that he was kind of knighted by George Lucas himself to inherit the aspects of the story that I think are most precious to people, which is, and I don't want to like introduce a bunch of straw man or generalize and imply that my experience with Star Wars is the same as anybody else's, but when I watched The Clone Wars and when I watched Rebels, I was really like, this is what Star Wars is about. And of course, if I sit down to watch A New Hope or Empire Strikes Back, it's still going to be one of the most awe-inspiring experiences that you could possibly have as somebody consuming pop culture, like no matter how many times you've seen it, right? But The Clone Wars takes place in the same general time frame as Attack of the Clones and Sith. In other words, the prequels, the derided prequels. Now, I ride for Sith, but that's a separate podcast.
Wow.
And that It was when people fell in love with Ahsoka. And it was this amazing ability to simultaneously establish this character who meant so much to so many people on her own, for her own choices and her own distinction and the things that she stood for and represented, but also because of what she unlocked about a story that we already had an attachment to. Her relationship with Anakin, we should just say, she is Anakin Skywalker's Padawan. She's Darth Vader's Padawan before he became Darth Vader. That relationship is, I think, as foundational to how I think about Star Wars as any in the canon, which is kind of an amazing thing to say out loud, but it's true. And so seeing her enter live action at last, it's one of the things that I think a lot of people who have grown so attached to her character have just been waiting on this figure who is elemental to the universe. Finally there.
So before we get into the specifics of who she is, because, I think this would come as no surprise to anyone. I didn't know that, have not seen those shows, had no idea other than she's a meme or a GIF. Like, people really like this character. So let me start at the very beginning and by saying,
with Grogu's birth.
Well, I have some notes on the name. I am first and foremost, as everybody knows, a Rosario Dawson fan. And I can neither confirm nor deny that I knew about this. But I will say that my reaction to this was, well, the second flex was when I was texting with her after watching the episode and asking her to come on the watch. She confirmed and did not deny that Lucasfilm would not like her doing press outside of what they agreed to. So she sends her regrets and is unable to answer all of our questions about her at this point. Just to say how fucking cool this is, because I think, I worked with her. I spent like a whole year with her. And I think that there are three things that really, 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 really animate her. One is geek culture.
New Jersey politics.
I'll get to that. Geek culture, Star Wars, Star Trek, comic books. 2, being an action star and being a boss. And 3, getting more voters registered and involved in our electoral process. And the election is over. So to see her get to do these things, because I think I've said this in other contexts on the show, like, we would have a scene in Briar Patch and her character would have to run across a parking lot, and they would bring in a stunt double, and the stunt double would be fine. And then she would do it in heels without breaking a sweat. She was born to play this part. And what was so exciting is that apparently, and Mallory, you can speak to this, the fandom cast her as this part quite some time ago.
Yep.
And we've spent this season of The Mandalorian talking about just one of the things that makes it feel so handmade in the best possible way is that the casting decisions are not coming from central casting, or else Amy Sedaris wouldn't be a recurring character on the show, or Horatio
Michael
Sands
Biehn
with gills.
wouldn't be in this show. Yeah.
It's cast with love and with affection, or probably friendship in a lot of these cases. And that when it comes time to deliver, to the fandom and deliver to our friends like Mallory, they didn't fuck it up. They didn't overthink it, right? They were like, here's a person who is born to do this and everybody wants to do it. Guess what? We're going to do it and we're going to deliver. And even as someone who had never encountered this character or even knew this factoid until you just dropped it on us, I felt it. I felt the force when she appears because it was beautifully framed and it communicated to us that this mattered. And so I know I'm beating the same drum over and over again, or in the spirit of this episode, the giant novelty gong, but they don't overthink it and they don't screw it up. And it's really hard to overstate how important that is. So now tell us why she matters.
Got to take a deep breath here. Maybe do some stretches. All right. I will actually try to keep this quick. Okay. Why does Ahsoka matter? First of all, I just will quickly shout out Ashley Eckstein, who voiced the character in both Clone Wars and Rebels. It was awesome. Ahsoka. Anakin Skywalker's Padawan. You can read some very funny interviews with Dave Filoni over the years where he talks about what it was like when George Lucas told the people who were helping to make the Clone Wars that Anakin had a Padawan, and they were all like, no, he doesn't. What are you talking about? And George's like, no, he does. Classic George Lucas Star Wars story. Anyway, She is a main character in Clone Wars. She has her own novel, 2016 E.K. Johnson novel called Ahsoka. That's really good, really fun to read. She's in Rebels as well and connects to that cast and that story in a really interesting way. Why does she matter? Top level summation here. First of all, she's a woman in Star Wars, and that means a lot to a lot of people. She is obviously introduced into the canon long after Leia, but I think in a lot of ways really paved the way for Rey. And I say that from the perspective of everyone trying to get back into the headspace where we all really remembered and appreciated how meaningful Rey's creation was, and not just the post-Rise of Skywalker malaise that everybody is in, right? Her relationship, again, to Anakin, really a defining thing in the show. The way that you understood his character and his arc, not only the evolution, the fall to become Darth Vader, but the humanity inside that allowed him to then become Anakin again, obviously in the original trilogy, she's fundamental to that. In part because, and this is a huge thing, she leaves the Jedi Order. So I don't know if you guys feel this way too, but one of the things that I'm always like slamming my head into my hand about when I watch Star Wars is like, Yoda, Mace Windu, can we just have a chat about like a better way to handle this, maybe? And then would we have Darth Vader? Would Palpatine have won? And the rigidity of the Jedi strictures and how many bad things happened because of that. And I think the really interesting thematic explorations that opens up about what happens when there's no room for subtlety or nuance in a person's life or how they choose to live that life, right? Ahsoka, I'll let people discover all of the plot points on their own, but spoiler, was falsely accused of something and left the Jedi Order in protest. She leaves very close to when Anakin eventually has his fall. And so you understand his fall totally anew based on what the loss of that relationship did to him. We get some very cool stuff in season 7 of Clone Wars, which was just on recently, that gave us a couple more entries into their relationship together. One of the most, and I mean this sincerely, this is not hyperbolic, one of the most exceptional duels, lightsaber duels in Star Wars history comes between Ahsoka and Vader in Rebels. It is animated, of course, and just the action of it, the pop of it, the flare, the color, it's thrilling to watch. And there's just like a gut-wrenching moment when I almost sent it to you guys, texted it to you earlier, and then I knew you wouldn't watch. When she breaks Vader's helmet and she can see, because she like can't accept that this has happened to her master and her friend, that this is really him, that this is what he's become. And when she sees his face and she hears him say her name, and then she's like, I won't leave you. It's just devastating. It's so sad and so beautiful. The white lightsabers. So she has originally, she fights with 2 blades, as you saw, a regular lightsaber and then a Shoto blade. She has this really distinctive fighting style, and that's obviously part of it too. She's elite. She's a badass. There's a Filoni interview from a couple years ago where he basically was like the only people who we could have put against her would have been Vader and the Emperor. Like, that's the caliber of fighter that we're talking about. And after she put aside the blades, the exact canon differs in her novel and in what we saw in season 7 of Clone Wars. But basically, she has to like go into hiding, right, after Order 66. And as we see in this episode, when we learn so much more about little baby Yoda Grogu, we should never lose sight of the fact that anybody with Force abilities was in grave peril after the Empire's rise. And she ends up forging these blades anew by purifying the previously bled kyber crystals. So like when, remember when I said I would keep this short? when we see a red blade, it's because a kyber crystal has been bled, like impurified. And so she purified them anew, and she has these iconic white saber blades that not only just look really cool and are fun to watch pop on your screen, but again, they represent that she is unique in the vast constellation of Star Wars. She has made different choices than people, and the ability to simultaneously forge these lasting and essential bonds with characters like Obi-Wan and Anakin, Ezra, Sabine, but also to choose her own path, to be an independent thinker, to not just accept what other people have told her. has made her very special to me, and I think to a lot of people. So a huge part of her story has been untold, and I think we're finally going to get it.
It's not just her story being untold. What I am continually shocked and amazed by when I speak to you or other super fans like Chris Ryan, it's truly stunning. Star Wars' 20-year commitment into not putting the good parts in the movies. Like, that's really, really, really wild. And Chris and I are people who have long championed, not necessarily for clicks, although maybe for like reads in the old magazine days, like, the most popular album by an artist isn't the best, or like the deep cuts, or we like the weird books that didn't quite work. Like, that's a thing. I get that. Maybe you order off menu at In-N-Out or whatever, but like at least the In-N-Out main menu is good because it's cheeseburgers. You know what I mean? Like, everything
Delicious.
You're saying, minus some nouns and adjectives I didn't understand, sounded very complicated and compelling.
It is.
And
It's
worthwhile.
great. Yeah.
And it's in a cartoon. Yeah, I like cartoons. Chris doesn't. He's the bad guy here. But it's in shows that the vast majority of people who even, casually say they're Star Wars fans haven't engaged with. That's so bizarre. So maybe the reason why Mandalorian is good, I'm just spitballing here, is because Lucasfilm made the decision to put the good parts in the show?
Yeah.
Is that far-fetched? Like, that's weird, because it's not just, they didn't talk about bleeding crystals, no offense. They just gave us this badass heroine who now we like.
So this is the crucial question that I'm kind of curious to hear Mal's take on. And you can't possibly answer this because who knows, but one of the interesting things that they have been doing with Mandalorian is introducing characters, be they beloved ones from the canon or just kind of like, oh, interesting. And then kind of leaving the planet that they're on and going somewhere else and doing something else. And for as much as we've now talked about Ahsoka and everybody else in this episode, this is the same episode as every Mandalorian episode. Mandalorian shows up with the child.
Right.
He needs something. The person who has that thing is like, I will give it to you, but you have to do something for me. Mandalorian does that. And then we find out at the end, in this case, she gives him just like another kind of breadcrumb trail to follow. So they're still telling the story in the way that works for them in this very small box that the Mandalorian operates in narrative-wise. I'm curious whether or not this will be an inflection point for the series, whether or not these storylines that are obviously bubbling right under the surface will start to be a little bit more prevalent, or whether this was episode 6, right?
5.
So there's 3 more, right?
Overall.
There's 3 more episodes this season. Will the last 3 episodes be he goes and fights a cave monster here, and then he goes to an ice planet there, and then he goes to a swamp planet here? Or are we going to start to see some of this stuff converge where Thrawn is obviously mentioned in this episode? That's who she's asking Elspeth about in the Kill Bill homage that was just fucking sick. Or will Moff Gideon come back? Like, are we going to start to get a little bit more continuity and serialization, or is it going to remain episodic and this is a 5-6 year plan for Lucasfilm?
So my guess, my prediction, founded, I'll be honest, more on my personal desire than on
it's the best kinds of
anything
predictions
else, is that it's going to be both. And I think if we pan back to two episodes ago, The Heiress, when Katie Sackhoff shouts to all my Starbuck Battlestar Galactica heads out there, came in as Bo-Katan, another key figure from the animated shows in the Filoniverse. She voiced the character in those shows as well. I think that a character like Bo, a couple points here. A character like Bo, I think, is more likely than Ahsoka and Thrawn and Ezra, who I'll get to in a minute, to play a role in The Mandalorian moving forward, because Bo has direct, deep ties to key figures in the main cast of this show. Moff Gideon, the Darksaber. Bo wielded the Darksaber. So what happened there during the Great Purge and the fall of Mandalore? What exactly are we going to learn about Din's history, that child of the watch line that we got from Bo in that episode? How does that
big for
connect?
us.
to what fans like you guys already understood about Death Watch and the role that Death Watch had played in Mandalorian culture. There's a lot to mine there. And I suspect, given what has unfolded so far in the 2 seasons of the show about Mandalore, about the way we will see the attempt to revive Mandalore happen on this show. I think that the Ahsoka Thrawn stuff is, I think this was a pilot setup.
So that was what I was going to ask you, Andy, is that, I mentioned earlier that it feels like they're pushing Mandalorian more to the center of Lucasfilm, frankly. Like that, I don't even know where we're at with the development of the various movies that, were being talked about. I mean, there's a Kevin Feige movie, Rian Johnson movies, that there are a variety of different projects going at any one time. Currently, what we know is that there's a Rogue One prequel, there's an Obi-Wan show.
The Cassian Andor show?
Yeah, right. And that there is and that there's an Obi-Wan show. And then a couple of times over the course of the season, it's been kicked around that there are other spinoffs coming from The Mandalorian, whether it's with Gina Carano's character, whether it's Bo-Katan, or whether it's Ahsoka. Like, this is the engine now, is what I'm saying.
And it's the smart play. It's just so much smarter to build these from the ground up as opposed to start on the highest possible, loudest, noisiest level and then tamp these stories down onto television. I mean, the ceiling for the show was always so high because I think even if it had remained the way you had, the way you just described it, Chris, the way it began, right, as like kind of marginal but entertaining and family friendly and a nice way to start a streaming service. Mallory, I know you're with me on this. Dainu, like that is enough for Disney Plus for everyone because after years of kind of bumpy management, that was a nice middle of the road success that could be pointed to for future growth. It's better than that. It's richer than that. It's deeper than that. And every planet they go to, there's a spinoff there. I'm not saying many people would want the ice fishing spinoff on the calamari planet that I personally want, but I'm saying that there's opportunity on each of these places with each of these guest stars, and the way that they're being handled seems now.
Right.
What's brilliant about all of this is that we've been saying, oh, this is so old-fashioned, it's gentle. But if you just put on your Bob Chapek capitalist hat, it's also savagely brilliant, right? Because we're getting just enough of each of these characters to want a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And then they can say, well, is this character trending well in which quadrant of fandom and what can we do with them? And the sky's the limit for the streaming service, especially now that people are getting used to, oh, there's a movie event or there's a rentable thing or whatever. So, and I'm sure Mallory can speak to this and probably will again as these stories come up, when we talk to you more about it. But if they want to have a more Ahsoka, does that mean there's an Ahsoka show? What does the show even mean? Maybe it's a 4-episode mini event where she finds the person that she's talking about and does the thing. Isn't that exciting? It might not be worthy of a feature film that has to open around the world and make $1 billion, and it's more than a 1-episode spinoff. But here you go. One size doesn't have to fit all when you're building from this as the template.
So, I agree with all of that, and I would draw one distinction, which is I think that what you're observing about kind of like the very organic, almost constant test balloons of, hey, did you like this planet? Hey, did you like this character? Would you like to spend more time there? Has been consistent across almost every episode. What we got in this episode was different because this opened up again the question of what happened to the rest of these characters' lives. People have been wondering about this. So the last, and guys, stop me if you've heard this before. I'll try to keep this quick. The spoiler epilogue of Rebels, which concluded, is Ahsoka at that point in a white robe carrying a white staff, a very clear, and Filoni has acknowledged this, he often compares Ahsoka to Gandalf. She's his Gandalf figure, and she had graduated from being Ahsoka the gray to Ahsoka the white. We see her in gray robes in this episode. What does that mean about what we thought we understood about the timeline? I'll come back to that in a moment. Ahsoka and Sabine Wren, another key character in the Mandalore verse, setting off to find Ezra Bridger, the protagonist of Rebels, one of the Jedi who is out there where we do not know. And we still do not know. And I think and I hope that the put Grogu on the Seeing Stone, have him reach out through the Force and see if anyone reaches back, is how Ezra is going to come back into the story.
Mallory,
And
I have to ask, Ezra,
yeah.
does he get the Dainu reference? Is he one of us?
Ezra doesn't roll on Shabbos.
Is this Return of the Jedi? Like, is this going to happen for us?
Listen,
This is
if that
huge.
can get you to check out Rebels, then let's roll with it, man. Let's see
know.
what happens.
I feel like our people aren't always the rebels, you know? It's but please go on.
So again, spoiler, Thrawn and Ezra, and Thrawn is, quickest possible version of this I can give is that he is a iconic Star Wars villain from the EU, from what is now Legends canon, who was brought back into the main canon by Filoni in Rebels.
He was the bad guy in the books that came out in the 80s, right?
Right, exactly. So you can read the Timothy Zahn books and get a better feel for Thrawn. Blue skin, red eyes, this like master tactician, loves art, has a great art collection. It's just,
A little bit like Donald
consumes the
Sutherland in
culture.
The Undoing.
And Ezra and Thrawn disappear together. Ezra basically sacrifices himself to take Thrawn off the map, shouts to the Purgles, the space whales who can jump
Nope.
into hyperspace. No, you guys
You had
I've
us.
lost
You
you
had
with
us,
the
but
space
we're-
whales. So, to me, Ahsoka trying to find Thrawn is Ahsoka trying to find Ezra. And that's how this is all going to come back together. Whether we get an Ahsoka movie, an Ahsoka show, or whether we basically get the continuation of Rebels in live action, I don't know, but I feel like it's heading that way. Of course, there's a less pleasant alternative, which I think we have to mention, given the Grogu of it all, which is that the person who's going to hear him is Palpatine, right? Because
Oh, no. They wouldn't. They wouldn't do it.
I hope not. But I don't want
That's like
to
season
totally
5.
ignore the fact that last episode, Dr. Pershing comes back into it. The idea of the Strand cast, what they're mining, little baby Yoda's high midichlorian count blood for the cases with the Snoke looking clones.
Yeah.
I just, again, give me Ezra, please. But we
One
have
of the
to mention
reasons
that.
why The Mandalorian is so pure still, even 13 episodes in, is because it is still in those beautiful early days when it can be what any of us thinks it should be. It hasn't yet had to commit to being the thing that it ultimately will be.
Right. It's not. Doesn't have an end game yet.
And because of that, I can watch it this way. I think Chris, to some degree, watches it this way too. I think of it and I consider it through the lens of a low-key, occasionally high-key repudiation of 7, 8, and 9 and how they mismanage things for the last few years.
that opinion really works for you.
It really works for me. And I don't think I'm speaking out of school when I say I think it works for people who are happily employed at Lucasfilm.
Sure.
I'm not saying that like in and of itself, there's like a rebel alliance within the company. I mean, the company is a company. They make choices and some are good and some are bad. But I do think that even from my tangential knowledge of people who work there, they are not blind to mistakes that were made, you know? And I think that everyone is thrilled with the success of this. And part of the success of it, repudiation's a big word, but paving a new path, let's say,
Yeah.
I think feels to me baked into it. And so as soon as you start saying unpleasant words like Snoke, or even in the other direction, like Watto or whatever, like it's not pure anymore. And I think Favreau has the weight. I mean, they hired him to do this and he did the damn thing. And I don't think I don't think we're just grasping at straws when we say, I think that his love of this series ends with the Ewok singing Jub Jub. Like, I don't think he wants to go there. So
Right.
I think we're safe.
Mal, thank you so much for joining me and Andy today. You expanded our universe.
You are,
It's
yes,
really
you are.
nice.
Our universe
Everybody should be
expansion.
listening to Binge Mode. It's one of the best podcasts out there. They're doing Marvel right now. And Mal, we'll have to have you back on to talk about Mandalorian as we wrap it up.
I would love to. I'm eternally yours and Grogu. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Mal.
We'll take a quick break and get to Melissa Maerz right after this. This episode is brought to you by Mint Mobile. New Year's resolutions are fun. the first couple of weeks. Then you kind of maybe conveniently forget about them halfway through January. No shame. It happens to us all. But this year I have a foolproof plan, at least when it comes to saving money. Just switch to Mint Mobile and you're done. Goal accomplished, because for a limited time, their wireless plans are $15 a month when you buy a 3-month plan. The great thing about Mint Mobile is there's no jaw-dropping monthly bills or unexpected overages, and all plans come with unlimited talk and text. Get this new customer offer today at mintmobile.com/watch. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details.
Okay, we're back. And Chris, even though we spoke to Mallory at great length, we didn't even get into Baby Yoda's name, which I'm cool with never saying.
We could save it for Thursday, but it was a real record scratch moment. I was like, Grogu?
Well, I also was sure that they had like spent 2 or 3 years like loosely market testing it. You know what I mean?
Right.
The best theory I heard was that they gave both the Mandalorian and Baby Yoda super dumb names so that no one would use them and just keep calling them
Baby Yoda and the
Baby
Mandalorian.
Yoda.
Yeah.
So I support that theory. Okay. Moving on quickly. Chris and I are so happy anytime we get to have friends on the podcast. And here comes another one. One of our oldest and dearest, who we used to work with back at Spin Magazine back in the day, is Melissa Maerz. And Melissa spent the last few years working on an oral history of the beloved 1993 Richard Linklater movie, Dazed and Confused. And the book is now out in stores. It's called All Right, All Right, All Right. And we were so happy to have Melissa on the show to talk to us about the book, the movie, her relationship with Richard Linklater, her conversations with the cast, what Nicky Cat is up to these days, all of it. I think we say this in our conversation with Melissa, but I just think it's worth saying now again before we get into it. Even if you don't have a strong opinion about this movie, even if you haven't seen it in a while, this book is still worth checking out.
Yeah,
it is.
It definitely, it feels like it tells the story of movies in the 90s in a lot of ways.
And it's a hell of an entertaining read. And because this is the holiday time, let us also say, if and when you buy this book, and you should, don't buy it from a big box store. Don't do Amazon. Go to your local bookstore. They have it, or they'll order it for you. You have a couple weeks till the big holidays. You can get it in time. Support your local businesses and your local bookstores. That's what Randall Pink Floyd would want you to do.
Definitely.
So that guy cared about the little guy. He did, actually. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get into our chat with Melissa.
Chris and I are so thrilled and pleased to be joined by an old and dear friend of us, Melissa Maerz, who is a brilliant writer, critic, journalist, thinker, and now the author of a fantastic book, All Right, All Right, All Right, The Oral History of Richard Linklater's Dazed and Confused, out now in bookstores everywhere. Melissa, thank you for coming on The Watch.
This is the best. It's so good to be on with you guys.
Melissa, wait, Chris, I got the title of the book wrong. She may notice it. I bet Melissa, as a stickler for details, I called it The Oral History of Dazed and Confused, but you, being the generous person you are, called it An Oral History, leaving the door open for future oral histories.
I believe it's actually The Oral History, but you must have the galley, which says...
I do.
Oh, wow.
So
you were being too modest.
I just hit publish on my ebook Oral History of Dazed and Confused.
Oh, good. Okay, well,
because
we've
I saw that
solved
little
this.
window of daylight there.
I know. I have much of the stuff that's on the cover has not a lot to do with me, except for the title.
and your name, which is rightfully there and
true.
hasn't changed. So we are thrilled to have you here. Dazed and Confused is obviously a very important movie to many people, and people have very strong opinions of it, more people than I even realized. And I know this is where all conversations about this book for you begin, including the one we had last week for the Austin Film Society. But I feel like for our listeners, it's worth getting into it this way too, because there are many movies that are beloved, and there are many movies that have become cult films. Why this movie, and why you, and why devote this many years of your life to this project?
Well, I knew there'd be good stories behind the scenes for lots of obvious reasons. Like, it's kind of a hinge point in a lot of people's lives. For Richard Linklater, obviously, it's his first studio film, and it was a lot of people's first movies, like, obviously Matthew McConaughey. But I think personally, what made me interested is that I read an interview with Richard Linklater saying that he wanted Dazed and Confused to be an anti-nostalgia movie. And it just felt funny to me that this anti-nostalgia movie has become the biggest nostalgia movie for so many people that I know. know that makes them nostalgic about the 70s or about high school. And now I think it makes a lot of people nostalgic for the 90s. So that was kind of the first question, was like, how did this anti-nostalgia movie become the biggest nostalgia movie of all time?
Was Dazed like a big movie for you when it first came out, or was it something that you eventually came to a little later?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was. I saw it in the theater my first year of high school. So I feel like it was I was the prime audience for this movie. And it's funny, it didn't really feel like the 70s to me. It felt like this is your future. Like, this is what the next 4 years of your high school life are going to be like. Which is kind of exciting and terrifying.
Yeah. Were you still wiping the ketchup and mustard off your face in the movie theater as you were seeing it? I mean, you were not freshmanized, though, of course.
I was not freshmanized.
Oh, good.
But I think, I'd never smoked weed before. When I saw that movie, I'm like, oh, that's what smoking weed is like. And like, I'd never been to a real high school party. I mean, I was a real, all of this just felt like this is what's going to happen in your life,
Yeah. Yeah.
It's such an interesting point to make, because I think that there is even across the eras, there's a common language of high school movies that have kind of taught us almost in a strange direction what high school should be like. I mean, this is because we're all essentially the same age. We were all in high school when this movie came out. And this, coupled with the John Hughes movies of the previous generation and what have you, there's a certain way of being and a certain set of expectations of the types of fun or frustrations you might have. Can you talk a little bit about why this movie got those things right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I grew up with the John Hughes movies, and none of them felt even slightly relatable to me. I like them, some of them, for different reasons, but they all seem to be about kids wanting to be rich.
Right.
And, there's always some kid's mansion that the kids are partying into, or someone's jumping into a pool, or something. It was just this world that I just could not relate to. And everyone kind of seemed like they were 45 years old. And what's funny about Dazed is it felt so much more real to me. Nothing really happens in this movie. It's all just these kids hanging out, doing nothing, really being bored. And just kind of most of the movie is them waiting for something cool to happen. I think, Andy, you mentioned, you're the hinge point of this movie is someone going to a party that's not actually happening anymore, a party that's canceled.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's the pinnacle of drama in this movie. But it just felt real to me and really relatable. It almost, you look at those John Hughes movies, and by comparison, Dazed and Confused kind of looks like a documentary almost.
Yeah, there's something, I think you touched on it just a second ago, but the way in which the performers almost uniformly have this very modern quality, in which they the way they're interacting and relating to each other has really contributed to the timelessness of it. I the only thing I can kind of compare it to is more Mad Men than anything like a John Hughes movie, where you're getting this sort of period piece and there are hallmarks of the time, but they are behaving in a way that is just universally recognizable as, oh, that's how people in high school act. And that thing you're saying about Hughes movies were often a fantasy, and this was much more of a reality.
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, you look at that party, the big party that they've been waiting to go to out in the woods, and everyone's kind of greasy and everyone's kind of bored, and nothing's really happening beyond people just kind of being like, hey man, what's going on? And I felt that's my people.
Yeah.
The people who are just kind of uncool, but trying so hard to fit in at this party.
And the genius of it is that there are people who are cool and people who are uncool, and people nominally the main character, Jason London's character Pink, who just traverse all the world seamlessly. But they all know each other because ultimately they're in a small town and they're in high school. And so they aren't in a different caste. They aren't in a different level of society. They're just in geography class together. And there's something that about that both lowers the stakes and opens up the honesty, I think, that makes it really essential viewing.
Yeah, it's so true. I think that Dazed was the first time I remembered seeing high school types who blurred into other types. Mm-hmm. Pink being the jock who's also the stoner and also kind of a smart kid who plays poker with the geeks. Nobody is really the jock or the nerd or the popular girl in the way that they are in the 80s movies. It was kind of fun to see that, because I think a lot of people relate to being a little bit part of different groups.
Well, it's a funny thing where it's Ferris Bueller is supposedly friends with everybody, but we never actually see him interact with anybody but Cameron and Sloane. We don't ever see Ferris hang out with jocks and weirdos and dweebs and whatever the line is in the principal's office, but you do see Pink kind of hang out with everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that, I mean, to be honest, is that it's Richard Linklater, right?
Yeah.
It's him making a movie about himself at that age. Although I do think that's true too. Like I went back and talked to his high school friends in Huntsville, and they do remember him being a guy who floated between different groups.
Yeah, I love that part of the book.
So you mentioned Richard Linklater. I can call him Rick now because I asked him last week, and he let me call him Rick before Sean Fennessy did. I wanted to make that clear on this podcast, just in case Sean had any doubt about that. And you talked about the amazing research and interviews you did, including travel, going to his hometown, talking to these people who knew him. There are a lot of stories, incredible stories in the book about filming and about the actors, and I'm sure we'll touch on some of that while we're talking to you. But I do think that since this podcast it's nominally about Chris's bad chicken recipes, but beyond that, I think we'd like to do a little bit of process talk for people who are interested in looking under the hood. And I wanted to get you talking a little bit about what it means to do an oral history, because as you brilliantly say in the introduction, that a good oral history is kind of seamless. It just feels like you're listening to these people talk to each other, but the reality couldn't be further from the truth. You're doing over 100, maybe even 150 distinct interviews, and then you have to build it like a Lego puzzle or something. Legos aren't puzzles, I do them wrong, but like a Lego something, brick by brick. Yeah. Can you talk us through kind of the nuts and bolts of that? You wrote an email to Richard Linklater, and then you just kind of have to shoe leather it, right?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I added that author's note later, and a lot of people have mentioned it. And the reason why I added it is because the lawyer was literally asking me, so were these two people in the same room when you were asking them both about this? And I was like, oh no, like I just assumed that people know the process. So I was like, I better make it clear in this intro that like, that's not the way it works.
Yeah.
It's just kind of tracking down all these people. And then every single person I interviewed, I asked, who are the two people who you think have the most interesting perspective, who I should talk to next? And the same people's names kept coming up over and over again. And I'm not just talking about cast, I'm talking about people in the crew. Linklater's editor, Sandra Adair, who has been with him since the very beginning, or almost the very beginning, people who really know him, and also people who had documents that I could look through. So people opened up their archives to me, and I was able to see, Linklater's angry memos that he wrote to executives at Universal. And
there's an amazing letter about Robert Plant. Like the stuff about Robert Plant is my favorite from Led Zeppelin, because he's mad about not being able to use rock and roll in the movie. Yeah,
the fights between Linklater and Robert Plant are great. And the stuff too, like Linklater, the angry way that he wrote about Robert Plant at the time. Like I think for a little while, I wasn't sure whether that belonged in an oral history to have quotes from the primary source. But after a while, I was like, it's such a contrast between who he was at age 31 and who he is now. It's impossible to have him restate that and really capture it the same way that using his actual words from the time would.
But that's the amazing thing about it, is that he, and this was borne out by the conversation we had, including him last week, he is such a generous person, and I think that, and you can speak to this, he's anti-nostalgia. He didn't necessarily want to do this. And yet
to do this. Let's be
he
clear.
Opened himself up to it. And so for people listening who maybe are, maybe they're interested in some of the things we're saying, but they're not sure they love this movie, the book is about so much more in this movie, including an incredible portrait of one of our great directors. And it begins with his childhood through his first movie, Slacker, into this movie and beyond. And he seems like he's not a co-conspirator, but he was with you through a lot of this process.
Yeah, in the beginning, I definitely think he did not want to do this. I mean, he even said he was sick of talking about Dazed and Confused when I first wrote him, and said that he didn't think it was his best movie.
He only wanted to talk about Fast Food Nation the whole time, and you kept having to steer him back.
It's always interesting to hear what are the favorite movies of people who I don't know. He still really loves Newton Boys. I don't know if he thinks that's his favorite.
Oh, wow.
Right.
That's a movie that I think he thinks is underrated. It's just interesting to hear those things. But when when he first agreed to do this book, I thought I might just have one interview with him and that's it.
Right.
So I had that interview. And then a while later, I had a very long interview, maybe I don't know. I was out in Austin and spent the day with him. Then after that, he was like, if you have questions, you can just call me. And then it kind of opened up from there and we got more and more conversations. Like he would call me, at night when he was going home from shooting something and we just talked for a really long time during that drive. But I didn't know it would be that way.
No, yeah. And one of the most amazing things about the book is the wealth of, like you mentioned, the primary sources, some of the documentation, the original shooting script. I have to say that whole section where you're kind of breaking down and the voices are breaking down what the movie could have been And there's the scene with the Vietnamese girls in town.
Yeah.
There's the scene where the girls are talking about kind of like mortality at the Moon Tower party and stuff that doesn't necessarily make it into the film. The film is a little bit more lighthearted, I think. Did you come across stuff like that changed your mind, not necessarily about how you saw what we know as Dazed and Confused, but what Dazed and Confused maybe could have been?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to talk about this scene without actually reading it to you to convey what it's like. But there's a rape scene in an early, very, very early version of this movie that still bothers me to this day. I mean, it bothers me because he did such a good job writing it and conveying, how something like that might have gone down in high school. But it really does tell you there are much darker scenes that could have been in this movie that didn't end up, like you said, that didn't end up in this movie. And I think it makes sense. I mean, I think that he thought it was hard to go from these highs of this like breezy high school movie to go in these really serious and really tough scenes in between. And ultimately he decided not to go there. But it does make you think that even now, what looks like a party movie, there are some pretty dark moments in the Dazed and Confused that we know now too. Yeah.
I mean, we were mentioning it, the freshmanizing plays very differently. This was something that, and for people who haven't seen the movie in a while, like the rising seniors are terrorizing the rising freshman boys with paddles, and the rising senior girls are squirting ketchup and mustard and raw eggs on the girls and humiliating them, sometimes with sexual talk in front of the boys. And this was true to Linklater's high school experience and has, I guess, challenged or amused or both audiences ever since. Some people think of that as funny. Some people think of it as horrifying. And it's all sort of folded into this. And it kind of, the fact that it's in there and works speaks to something that I think is really amazing that your book illuminates, which was Linklater's, I mean, he was older than his cast. He was in his early 30s, but he let the movie be what it wanted to be, which is, feels like something, that's like some Jedi 60-year-old director stuff, and it's weird that he can be as petulant enough to pick a fight with literally every studio executive, with Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin, but also be zen enough to allow this movie to become what has become a beloved masterpiece.
Totally. It's so funny with a lot of people who were in the editing room. A lot of them are like, there's this other movie that, was darker and like more layered. Like they see it in a different way of these scenes that got cut out. And Linklater was always like, no, it is what it needed to be. And also, despite the fact that I've chronicled this crazy intense fight between him and the executives of the studio, he got the movie that he always wanted to make. And so did they in some ways. Even though Universal wasn't with him every step of the way, they got a movie that's now a major cult classic. So I think, both sides kind of won despite the fact that they hated each other along the way.
Yeah, he's such a fascinating character in the last 30 years of movie history because if you start with Slacker, you think, well, this guy's just going to be on the outer edges of pop culture, this incredibly maverick independent voice. And over again, he has made like pretty mainstream movies and he makes them in his way. But Where'd You Go, Bernadette and Newton Boys, like you mentioned, School of Rock, like he is like a pretty dependable director for hire at times. And I thought that like this sort of, even in this incredibly personal story that I think you look back on, you're like, oh, that must have been Richard Linklater, like top to bottom director's cut. Everything that's in there is in there because he wanted it to be, or it's exactly the way he wanted it. In some ways, for as personal as Dazed and Confused is, it was about like making a independent film on a studio system, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you think about that at the time, like, so many directors might have said, I'm not going to work with a studio. Like this is in the 90s when it's like, oh, you're not going to sell out, but he knew, he was like, I just want someone to fund the film. And so I can make it the way that I want to make it. And exactly like you said, Chris, like so many of his movies, even something like, Bad News Bears, you can see where it's personal for him. Like baseball is super personal for him. Or even this series that he just made about animal rescue. He's a really hardcore vegetarian and has been for a very long time. And you can tell how those projects are personal for him. So he's still, even when it's big budget or low budget, he's always making very personal things.
One thing that all three of us know well from our time as music journalists is that the work that is most beloved by fans is often not the most beloved by those who created it. And, like I guess a broader example of that is like interviewing Tom York from Radiohead and wanting to talk to him about Creep. Like there's this disconnect where people are like,
for a
no,
second, I thought you were acting like we as music critics had fans that often come up to us and are like,
about our early work.
Yeah. Do me a favor. Will you just read that review of Fugazi's End Hits for me, man?
My review of Fold Your Hands, Child, You Walk Like a Peasant, skillfully line edited by John Dolan in 2000. Yes, it was a little bit about Scottish people in the rain, but but what really struck me about this book is that while Linklater's, reaction and relationship to the movie is a little more complicated, by and large, the cast feel as precious about this time in their life and this moment and what this movie meant to them as the fans do. Can you speak a little bit to that and your reaction when you got these actors on the phone, and actors from people who immediately retired from the business and went on to different lives and careers, to Matthew McConaughey, who continues to delight in performing, basically cosplaying as himself when he's not playing another part in movies.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think people kind of see it as the last. I think because it was a lot of people's first movie or breakthrough movie, doing this movie was such a creative process. They're improvising lines in some senses. Some of them are writing their own scenes. They're really being encouraged to bring themselves to this role. And I think a lot of them thought like, oh, this is just what making movies is like. And then fast forward to a lot of them going to LA or going back to LA and being like, oh, no, wait, movies are not like this. Like directors are not always going to let you contribute creatively on this level. So I think that contributes to part of it. And then also I think it's like, think about the job you loved most in your 20s and how, it has shaped probably a lot of the rest of your career. So I think they can't help but be nostalgic.
We mentioned that Belle and Sebastian review. That was my favorite job of the 2000s. But also we should say,
and there's Dazed and Confused.
That is. There's where's the oral history? Where's an oral history about that, Melissa? But that and there have been great excerpts. I think the Ringer published one as well, just detailing how much of the lifestyle of the movie was being reenacted by the cast, who were having really intense love affairs and smoked all of the weed in Central Texas while making the movie. But can you talk a little bit about the enthusiasm specifically of the cast, getting them on the phone, like the differing reactions, right? Because you mentioned some people like Parker Posey, who, along with Joey Lauren Adams, seem to have invented their characters and made themselves very significant on the screen. Could you give us a couple examples of some reactions from the cast, for example, that were positive, full of memories, and others who had a little bit more conflicted relationship to the film?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really mirrors high school, right? Like you ask people, what was high school like for you? And there's going to be people who are like, oh, it was amazing. And like, I dominated. And there are other people who are like, it sucked and people were mean to me. And the people who think that others are mean to them, those people might not even remember that person or might not see it that way. So I think there's a lot of that kind of blurring of the lines between a movie, the experience of making a movie about high school, and the way you might actually remember high school or your early 20s or however old they were. So I think a lot of people, like you said, were so caught up in the romance of this creative environment and hooking up with each other and creating real chemistry that you could see on screen. I think McConaughey's part of that. His role expanded because people really loved hanging out with him. And then you get people like Michelle Burke-Thomas, who played Jodie, who's Mitch's older sister in the movie, who had a more complicated time, who loved it in terms of an acting experience, but really felt like she didn't fit in with the rest of the girls, felt like some of the other girls were mean to her, still almost 30 years later feels kind of hurt by the things people said in the book, I think, about her. So I think people have had very mixed memories, most of which are really rosy, but some of which are kind of hard.
One of the things that often happens, especially like when we're talking about movies on like rewatchables or something like that, is we talk about an actor or actress's filmography as if it's like these series of chain reactions. And that there are all these like very like choose your own adventure moments and then obviously they were catapulted to superstardom based on this. But the funny thing about Dazed and Confused is because there's this lag between its release and then its cult phenomenon status. I almost feel like they sometimes like it's false to say that Dazed like makes McConaughey or makes Affleck, because in a lot of ways, like I think McConaughey probably would have happened maybe either way, or maybe Affleck would have happened either way, or that these are almost like, do you feel like Dazed happens in a vacuum for a lot of these performers? Or do you think that it's the thing that changes their careers, one way or another going forward?
Well, to me, it's like exactly what you said. People think it's like this launch pad. And then you look at what happened immediately after that movie. It's like, Anthony Rapp went to work at Starbucks right after this, you know, and it's like Ben Affleck was still auditioning for like teen dramas and stuff. So it didn't really happen that way. And I think it really shows you, I think everyone in that movie is so talented, and so much of it is luck. And so much of it also is who goes to bat for you. Like McConaughey is obviously incredibly talented, but he met this guy, Don Phillips, who was a casting director, and Don Phillips, for whatever reason, decided out of all the people in this movie, McConaughey is going to be the one who I really go to bat for, to the extent of, he had McConaughey move in with him in LA for a little while. He got him an agent. He told him how the industry worked basically behind the scenes, and just kind of set him up to be as successful as he is today. And he didn't do that for everyone in that movie. So I think that's part of it too.
I mean, there are amazing details of the post-Dazed life captured in the book. I won't give all of them away. I think probably the greatest one, though, is Jason London getting a new laptop and calling AppleCare to get advice on it, and Wiley Wiggins answers the phone because that's his job at the moment.
I know, everyone's like, it's not real, that can't be real, but it's real.
Or the fact that Kristen Hosso plays Sabrina so beautifully, and then decided this isn't for me, and has had a great career as an activist. But that she basically, and I know there's details to this, and Rick, my pal, clarified this when we talked, that Claire Danes also auditioned for that part, and though she was too young, I still think choosing the unknown was the right move. All that to say, I think that when we think of things as canonical and we love them, we think of them as just celebratory. Like, and there's a version of this book that could just be like a championship parade of like, you made this great thing. And the detail that I just love so much, and this speaks to your amazing skill in bringing it to life, is we get a window into just being young in a deeply uncertain profession that I think is universal. And so we see these people, these actors, from the vantage point of 25 years or longer, 28 years now, they've just had some stuff. And so you hear about Adam Goldberg and Nikki Cat running into each other at auditions thinking they were better than this. And also this incredible chapter at the end that I'd love you to expand on a little bit. Well, I'd love for you to expand on it in general, but expound on it in this podcast, where it's just like Hollywood in the 90s, and Affleck and Damon and Jon Favreau and Vince Vaughn and all these guys are just kind of young and hungry, and they have no idea what's going to happen. And we're reading about them, and we know what happened. And it's very powerful to read it that way.
It really is. And also like the minute things that cause people to go off in one direction versus another direction. Like or maybe not so minute, but it's interesting to me that one of the reasons Affleck said that he wrote Good Will Hunting was that he was tired of people thinking he was an asshole. That like people thought he was an asshole in Dazed. And then, he did Mallrats. And then he heard that Quentin Tarantino was like, who's that guy in Dazed Confused? What an asshole. And then, he was like, I don't think people are realizing the craft I'm putting into the performance of an asshole.
And what's amazing is that after Good Will Hunting, no one ever thought ill of him again. Like it worked.
Yeah.
It totally worked. Slam dunk.
I was curious, have you thought about when you were talking to these people, because like you mentioned, like there are some people who have sort of like issues with their memories or other person's memories of the experience. Do you think it would have been much different to have done this book 10 years ago? Like, I wonder how much age has kind of given people perspective, but also leveled them out about like their kind of relationship to the project.
100%. And I feel so lucky about that. I mean, Linklater even told me that he was at a time in his life when he was ready for this, and that he might not have been ready for this at a different time. A lot of people told me that. There's a set deck on the movie who was really great to talk to. And she actually was a longtime indie rock manager for bands like Pavement. And she had just moved across the country and was like opening up all these boxes from her previous life. And she was like, this is the right exact moment to talk to me. So I think that was true. I think it might have been a little too painful for some people. And with the time passing, they were kind of ready to revisit it again.
And what's incredible is all these people, over 100 people, are forever connected because of this movie. But the movie is a static thing that exists in the world and separate and apart from reunions. And there have been some. And there was a really fascinating reunion live read that happened just last month that I recommend people check out on YouTube. You now, Melissa, you are the glue that has connected these people in a really fascinating way. You are in all of their lives. And I was wondering what that has been like for you. Is it because I think we all know that the relationship between interviewer and interviewee can extend beyond the tape recording sometimes. And What has that been like for you over the last year after you did the initial interviews or the substantive interviews? Have people continued to be in touch with you? Have they checked in with you after they've read the quotes? Like, what's your life been like after the final draft was sent in?
Yeah, it's interesting. I want to hear from everybody, good or bad. If they hate the book or love the book, I would love to hear. But some people I sent the book to and have not heard back from it at all. Some people have been in touch with me to try and get in touch with other cast members. Some people have reconnected because of the book.
Wow.
And some people still text me, like after there was a Dazed and Confused live read recently to raise money for, getting out the vote in Texas. And after that, a bunch of people texted me to be like, what did you think of this? And what did you think of that? It's kind of like a little bit of gossip. And Nicky Cat still texts me songs he likes sometimes. We talk about music.
I mean, could you give him our numbers? Because Chris and I have we are longtime Nicky Cat aficionados.
Yeah, I just want to talk to him about Way of the Gun.
I'd love to talk to you guys.
he is definitely a question mark. Were most of the live read questions about Rory Cochrane? Like, was he? Because many people like Ben Affleck insist they are not their characters. Ben Affleck is not a bully who paddles people, but Rory Cochrane played Slater, the stoner. The most, that's saying something in this movie, but the most extreme stoner. His performance in the live read may have been method, unclear.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I wish I did. What's interesting about Rory Cochrane is, to me, he seems very different in real life than he comes across in that movie. Like, he's kind of a very intense, kind of soft-spoken, kind of sensitive guy, is the way he strikes me. Not at all like Slater in the movie. So I'm not. I'm just as baffled as everybody else. I don't really know.
I think that's like across the board. Like, if you look at, when you actually take a step back and look at who's in that movie, like, I think that you can look at McConaughey and be like, oh well, he's just doing Matthew McConaughey. But like, Parker Posey is like a Lower East Side art chick. Like, she's a super cool New York City character who's just transplanted into Texas and is doing this Texas high school mean girl thing that's really amazing. I mean, the performances are actually pretty fantastic like that.
Definitely. You forget how much goes into these performances. Like, the weird thing about McConaughey is everybody says that's just McConaughey, but that's not what they were saying when he came in there. Like, everybody said he came in there with like khakis and like a golf club, and they were like, this guy? Like, he seems like he's way too clean cut for this sleazy character. So it's interesting that even McConaughey was really like doing a performance.
I love one of the details, you mentioned it earlier, alluded to it, that his performance was just so compelling and he was so magnetic that he just ended up in more and more of the movie. But I love the way Linklater does this and the way you captured it, that he kind of approaches it, even though he is fastidious and he's a technician like all directors are, but it's kind of like he has a mixing board in front of him and he's not sure what the movie's going to be. And, when I watched the movie again recently after reading your book, it did strike me, as you say in the book, why is Wooderson in the final scene? He's not even in high school.
Yeah.
It was supposed to be Pickford, but McConaughey's just great. And so he's there. And that was such a smart, intuitive way of making a movie towards what the movie wanted to be, right? And he did kind of ascend at the expense of the other actor who probably suffers the most in your book. We should probably touch on that just briefly. The actor Sean Andrews, who plays Pickford.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that the mixing board is the perfect analogy. Like, I think he just wanted real chemistry and he just wanted to see, even in the auditions, sometimes they would just have people go up and interact with each other, just like watch to see how people ate pizza together at an audition. Like, who does that now? But you know what I mean? Like, they just spent a lot of time just observing and seeing how people interacted with each other. So I think that really behooved McConaughey that he got along well with a lot of people in the cast.
I basically have one more final question for you.
Yeah.
When do you think you will next watch Dazed and Confused?
Oh, that's such a good question.
Is the over-under, is it 8 years?
No, I mean, I think I have done a lot of research for this book, and yet still people tell me all the time that they have watched this movie more than I have, or they'll have some tiny thing that I didn't notice. So I think it might be sooner than I think. I mean, I love it when people write me and tell me things that I didn't notice, or a little bit deep background of someone in Texas that they knew who was in this film. I'm still not sick of it yet. Ask me again next year.
I would also just throw in here, and Melissa has heard me say this, and I challenge our listeners to see if the same applies to you. More than almost any movie that I remember lovingly from my youth, This movie feels like a sieve. It's almost entirely subjective. Every time I see it, I've remembered it wrong, because as it's grown and as we've grown in age, like the parts I thought were important aren't important and vice versa. And it's kind of slippery.
You find
Maybe
yourself identifying with different characters.
Yeah, now I'm more like the hard-ass coach, I think, ultimately. I think that's how most people see me.
Right.
But like in the spirit of the mixing board thing, like it's just it's hard to, and this is what makes also the book so special, it's hard to hold this movie in your hand because it's just kind of oozing and sliding all over the place, and it means a lot to different people for very different reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I think all my favorite movies, you watch them differently at different stages in your life, and you remember different parts of them differently. It's like with Slacker, like there's certain monologues in Slacker that might seem silly at first, that seem more profound now, or like people always say that things change, as you get older, and the things that seem important might be not the same things that seemed important when we were younger.
And you know how we know that is true is because Chris has actually pulled a reverse McConaughey, where he actually used to be more like Wooderson and now he wears golf khakis.
That's right. That's how most people age.
That is true. That is actually true. It is the reverse. Well, Melissa, thank you so much for coming on The Watch and talking to us about the book. It's the oral history of Dazed and Confused. We will not make that mistake
also
again.
And oral history.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's it for now. When Chris's competing volume, which is just interviews with Sean Andrews and Mila Jovovich, comes out.
I would read that. I would totally.
It's called Scores Settled. All right. Is in bookstores now. Please go buy it at independent bookstores, which need your support more than ever. Melissa, it's great to talk to you.
Melissa, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, you guys. This is fun.